Yes, yes, the one, yes. 18 months, 2 years. Yeah. Yes, yeah, and it's company secretary that been delayed from sharing any of that. Yes, it was the question itself. We're not keeping the same, right. Natural colour of just working with what's already there at the same time. Working on the garden before, we've had some discussions and I had so we're going to do a video.
More than what's okay. Well, let's see. Yeah, okay.
Right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and I'm just going to be doing the introductions and moderating the Q&A and things like that. In terms of the introduction, I have two housekeeping announcements which I always have to make. The first is if the fire alarm should go off, you mustn't use the lift. You have to go down the stairs. And if you need any help getting down the stairs, then approach our staff or anybody who looks fit enough to help you. And the second thing is please don't leave any valuables in our cloakrooms downstairs. Nobody's monitoring those. So if you've left a laptop in a bag or something like that, it's probably better to pop down now and pick it up and bring it up here and keep it with you. So I'm delighted we've got Ben Jones here from the Oxford University Arboretum to speak to us. I've been talking to Ben and his colleagues for some time about their projects involving Japan, which particularly involve what's it called, the municipal gardens in Toyama City. So I visited the Arboretum and seen some of the rare species, and there's a particular area there which is based on the mountain by Toyama City, right? So some of the rare species from Japan are being grown in that particular area. So we've managed to get Ben to come along and talk to us here about it. He's the Arboretum Curator at the Arboretum in Oxford University. And it says here he's passionate about plant conservation with a particular focus on trees. So that's just as well. Yep. Well, really, that's probably all I need to say to introduce you, Ben. So I'll pass straight over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. And I'd just like to start by saying thank you for inviting me to talk this evening. I've been looking forward to this for some time, and it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about the work that we're doing in Japan and sort of the work we're doing between sort of Oxford and Toyama and other locations. I might just grab some water. Yeah. Before I get into the talk itself, I think it's worth noting that a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about this evening actually started by a Japanese PhD student, Nodaka Nakamura, who was a student in Oxford. She was studying her DPhil, and maybe had she been studying the flora of Chile, then I might although probably not here, been talking about the flora of Chile. But her research sort of focused on the flora of Japan and looking at sort of what we call bioquality hotspots, which I'll talk about this evening. And that really became the premise to what has been almost 15 years of work now. And the Botanic Garden and Arboretum decided that we needed to sort of try and bridge that gap between the science and the horticulture, and we decided to sort of focus on Japan because we could not only do the botanical surveys but collect plant material and then grow that at the Botanic Garden and Arboretum. So this evening I'm going to kind of take you on that sort of journey and look at the background to the work and some of the research that's going on, and then the botanical surveys, the seed collecting, and how that all kind of integrates sort of into our work in Oxford, but also some of the other projects that have come off that relating to cherry trees. So we'll jump straight in, and Japan has an incredible flora that starts perhaps up in Hokkaido, and the alpine zone of the flora sort of about 1,500 meters or above in Hokkaido, but then in central Japan, in Honshu, you'll find that sort of 2,500 meters above, and it's sort of defined with quite a harsh sort of climate, sort of snow cover for quite a period of the year. And then in terms of the vegetation, we're looking at sort of dwarf shrubs and tundra communities, so you're looking at sort of pines, rhododendrons, and other plants. And then as we sort of start coming down into the cool temperate or the boreal zone, and that's typically found in northern Honshu and certain areas of Hokkaido. Cold winters, heavy snowfall, and sort of short sort of growing season. And then you start to find, in terms of the vegetation, sort of mixed forests of beech and fir and spruce. And spruces in particular are a pioneer species similar to birch. And then some of the other characteristic sort of species that you will find in these regions, we've got birches, spruce, larch, and dwarf pines again. And then coming further down into the temperate zone, we have across the sort of central regions of Honshu, where you start getting very distinct seasons, and we then start getting into the deciduous broadleaf forests of beech and oak, maples, birch, and magnolia. And then we also start coming across conifers such as firs, hemlocks, and the Japanese umbrella pine. In fact, this photo was taken on Mount Musashi in Niigata Prefecture, and actually the photo was actually taken on the very sort of spot of the sort of the northernmost range of the Japanese umbrella pine in Niigata, or Scydoptis verticillata. Oh, I've hit the wrong button, sorry.
That's all right.
Right.
Great, wonderful, thank you. Right, here we go. And then coming further down into the warm temperate zone, and that's typically across southern Kyushu, Shikoku, southern parts of southern Honshu. We start getting the mild winters, warm summers, abundant rainfall, and these sort of forests are the sort of evergreen oaks and laurel forests, and then oaks and so forth. But then we get these sort of transition species as well, such as the camellias, orchidas, and Japanese cedars, although the latter being sort of planted fairly extensively. And then coming further south again into the subtropical zones, sort of Okinawa, the island of Amami and so forth, hot, humid, mild winters, influenced by the Kuroshio current. And the vegetation here, we've got these sort of evergreen broadleaf forests, and then sort of tree ferns and cycads and mangroves. And I thought, sort of with all of that in mind, it'd be useful just to sort of put Japan into sort of a regional context. And in East Asia, incredibly high floristic diversity. We have 31 endemic families, which in fact no other part of the world has such a high number, and 600 endemic genera. And Japan specifically, we've got over 7,500 species, we've got 315 families, and we've got actually sort of 25% of the flora that only occurs in Japan that is in fact endemic. However, one of the sort of challenges is the fact that 25% of the flora in Japan is threatened with extinction. And to sort of add to this, if we look at Japan's forests, that 2/3 of the national land are covered by forests, but 10 million hectares of that, is a single species sort of plantation, be it Japanese cedar, larch or cypress. And at the moment now, these plantations in many cases are sort of fully ready for harvesting. And so this brings us to a more regional sort of focus, and Japan in fact is one of 36 global biodiversity hotspots, and this map sort of shows their global distribution. And a biodiversity hotspot is defined by having 1,500 or more endemic species, of which Japan has almost 2,000. But notably, that only 30% or less of its natural vegetation remaining. And when this sort of concept was first published in 2000, at the time, there were only 10 global biodiversity hotspots around the world. And so the fact that these days there are now 36 kind of demonstrates the pressure on biodiversity globally. But one of the challenges with this concept is the fact that it's sort of global, it's not local, and sort of focusing on number of species, we have to recognise that not all areas are equal. And so the question is, how do you prioritise within this hotspot? We know that Japan is a global biodiversity hotspot, but we also know that large parts of it are not. And so the question is, how do we sort of find hotspots within hotspots? And so this is where the research sort of comes in. And we've been operating within what's called the bioquality concept, and it was Modica who produced the first bioquality hotspot map. And as you can see here, it expresses the concentration of globally rare species, but locally. And it does this by focusing on quality, not quantity, and it's looking at the distribution of a species. And so all plant species, in the case of Japan, have been put into their star categories, where we have black star as the most rare, and then green star as the most common. So the green star species will be globally common, going across Asia, maybe into Europe. And those stars are weighted, but they are weighted in an inverse proportion to the species distribution. So your globally rare are weighted 27, and your globally common are weighted 0. And by doing so, we can calculate the genetic heat index, and the GHI, you can sort of liken that to sort of centigrade and temperature. And so when you take a checklist, when you take a flora species into their star categories, we can then calculate at multiple scales the genetic heat index of these different areas. And it was Modica, in fact, who produced the first sort of work on this for Japan. And so building on Modica's work, and this is where my research has sort of focused, I've built a database of the Japanese flora, which now contains over 9 million records. And these data have been sort of compiled from a range of different sources, from online herbaria, Modica's work, local floras and checklists, but also ground truthing this work and kind of getting out into Japan, working with local partners, and conducting botanical surveys to sort of see whether our results and so forth, are true or accurate. And within this, we have to ask ourselves the question, what constitutes a good record? And a good record is an accepted scientific name, and for that record to be geo-referenced. And with the two, that enables us to produce the hotspot maps. And we can see here the sort of taxonomic breakdown in terms of number of species and so forth, but also the number of taxa that have been assigned stars. And so what we can see here, there are 710 species within the flora of Japan that are not only endemic to the country, but in many cases not only occur just in one prefecture, but only on one or two mountains, and that is it. And then at the bottom you can see GX, and actually those are species that have been introduced to Japan. And just to give you an example of some of those some of those plants. On the right hand side here we have a species of birch, Betula platyphylla, and that's a green star species, so it's globally common. And we're not saying that these aren't important. In fact, often, they're very important from an ecological perspective in terms of their role, within a forest or a landscape unit. But over on the far left, we have Betula chichibuensis, which I will talk about a bit more this evening. But this species of birch is not only endemic to Japan, but only occurs in Saitama Prefecture and on 2 mountains, and that is it. And what we can see here, just very briefly, using the database and the analysis from that, we can produce these sort of maps. So we have at the top here the floristic groups at 1 degree resolution, 0.125, but also the genetic heat index scores. And what we're starting to see is hotspots appearing within hotspots, where as we increase the resolution, as we build the database with a lot more data, what we can see here, are these hotspots. And you would assume that down in the Ryukyus and sort of southern Japan, where we know that this is a hotspot from a floristic perspective. But as you go up the degrees of latitude and you increase the resolution, what we're finding are these sort of hotspots, much further up the country. And just to kind of give you, I suppose, some more recent results from this, having sort of modelled these data and produced these distribution maps, what we've been doing in more recent times is ground truthing these results. And so focusing on Picea koyami, which occurs in the Yatsugatake mountain ranges in Nagano Prefecture. This is a black star species, it's critically endangered. And by producing these maps back in the UK and then going to Japan, working with our colleagues in Japan and conducting the botanical surveys, we've been able to locate these populations. And what I should also add is that the GHI value is globally comparable. And so, although the floristic composition on a mountaintop in Liberia is going to be different, a GHI score of 200 or more is actually globally significant. And so one of the roles of these results is to sort of enable people to understand the significance of the plants and the flora that they're working with. And this is just some photographs of the Picea koyami in Nagano Prefecture, and I'm pleased to say that we've got work ongoing with this, focusing on sort of in situ conservation programs. So that was a sort of whistle-stop tour of the sort of the research and the sort of scientific work that underpins the rest of what I'm going to sort of talk to you about this evening. And the work in Japan started in 2012, and our first visit actually focused just on meeting and greeting, just building relationships and understanding what our partners would like to work on, as well as the work that we would like to do. And over those years, that's enabled us to sort of strengthen working relationships between Japan and the UK and between partners in Oxford. We've made over 400 different seed collections of different species, which has generated lots of herbarium vouchers, lots of data capture, and then the database will be published online. And then we have over 25,000 images, which will underpin a lot of our collections, and then seed banking and benefit sharing, as well as building relationships with different botanic gardens. In fact, we've signed 2 memorandums of understanding, which I'll talk about this evening. And then excitingly for us was the opportunity to work with our partners in Toyama in particular to reintroduce 17 different species or cultivars of cherries to Japan, as well as seed exchanges and lectures. And this evening I want to focus actually on our relationship with Toyama Botanic Garden. And this is a garden that we've worked with since 2012. And this photo was taken, I think it was 2017 or 2018, when we signed the MOU with them. And we have Professor Simon Hiscock and the director of the Botanic Garden and Arboretum, and then Nakata-san and the team from Toyama. And I'm really pleased to say that not only was that 5-year MOU signed, but that's now been extended for a further 5 years. And it was great to see that relationship sort of picking up coverage in the media. And as part of this MOU, we had a seed exchange. And the team in Toyama very kindly gave us seed from the Japanese cedar, Cryptomeria japonica. This was one of the first populations where they recorded sort of male sterile Cryptomeria, so it's not producing pollen. And those trees are growing very well now in Oxford. And as part of that seed exchange, we gifted Toyama seed from our famous black pine that was at the Botanic Garden. And that specimen actually was the first introduction to the UK. But it was also Tolkien's favourite tree in the garden, and he was often seen sort of in the garden, and the tree itself kind of gave inspiration for Treebeard and other parts of his writings, which was great. So it was wonderful to be able to give that seed to Toyama. There are specimens planted at the Botanic Garden, but this one in the middle here is actually planted outside the Literary Museum in the city. So it's great to be able to share that with them. And at the Botanic Gardens in Toyama, they've created the Oxford border, which goes from strength to strength each time. I'm very lucky enough to see that. And as Jason mentioned at the beginning, in Oxford we have been developing what we refer to as our Mount Tateyama collection. And there are almost 80 different plants in this collection now, and every single one of them has grown from seed that we've collected off that mountain with staff from Toyama. And the Arboretum, the vision has to be 200 or 300 years. It's great that we've got these wonderful big trees to enjoy now, but actually we need to be thinking multiple generations in advance, and this is very much a long-term commitment. At the moment it's woody plants, but as those trees and shrubs establish and shaded areas are created, then we'll get the herbaceous layer in and so forth. But short of taking everybody to Toyama and to that mountain, which would be great, our hope is that you can come to the Arboretum and get a feel for some of the beautiful, wonderful plants that are on that mountain. In this picture here, I should note, actually top left, this is a hazel leaf birch, Betula coralifolia, and then bottom right and in the middle is the Katsura tree, Cicidophyllum japonicum, which gives off that wonderful candy floss sort of burnt sugar aroma in the autumn. But one of the great things about collaborating, especially with our partners in Japan, obviously is the work, but it's also the social. It's also about building those personal relationships, and it's been really wonderful to be able to spend time, both inside and outside of work, with the team in Toyama, and who are incredibly passionate about their plants. And this is something that is so important when it comes to doing the field work, that actually that it's collaborative, that it's as much to do with what they're researching and working on as much as it is ourselves. And I'm always in complete awe of their plant knowledge of their local flora. And so going back to the bioquality concept and the database and those maps, that's the sort of the desk-based side of it, but the sort of the enjoyable part, even more so actually, is the botanical surveys, which underpins that research and the ground truthing. And so we use a method called rapid botanic survey, and although it kind of makes you think that we run around really fast looking at as many plants as possible, it's much to do with how quickly we can process the data and these herbarium vouchers, but it's a very efficient sort of biodiversity assessment. And we can do sometimes 3 or 4 surveys in a day. It's very systematic, and it's very much a team approach that working with local partners as well, we're producing a lot of herbarium vouchers, sort of dried specimens for verification at later points. But then applying the bioquality concept and putting those species into their star rating actually illuminates that survey site in terms of its significance, by being able to calculate the GHI value And then this work can also contribute to conservation and impact assessments. And as I mentioned earlier, it's scalability, that actually this is something that can be done, you know, on a small patch of land all the way up to a sort of a country level sort of scale in some cases. And these surveys give a wonderful opportunity to kind of really learn plants and sort of get hands-on, but it also brings you face to face with some of the other components of field work, and that has certainly been an interesting experience, shall we say. This is a tiger keelback snake, top left, but actually I'm not so worried about spiders, but it's the hornet. When I hear that hornet sort of coming through, that tends to make me a bit more nervous. But as I was mentioning, you know, these are some of the team from Toyama, and as I said, working together, especially when it comes to botanical surveys, you know, it's a real privilege actually to be able to access some of these special sites in Toyama, and not only do we get the opportunity to work with staff, but the friends of their botanic garden, often on a Saturday or Sunday, they will go and botanise, and you know, it's great to be able to join them. And again, it's just, you know, so impressed with their sort of local knowledge of their flora. And you know, the nice thing about building these relationships and experiencing these lovely plant communities with the friends of the garden is that they also share with you their favourite restaurants and their favourite places to eat. And I probably enjoy the food as much as the plants. I probably shouldn't say, probably slightly more. But coming back to Toyama and conducting these botanical surveys, Toyama actually holds the third oldest population of the Japanese cedar, the oldest being down in Nakashima, the second in Niigata Prefecture, and here the third oldest population which is in Toyama. And it's wonderful to be able to kind of, you know, sort of work in these areas, in and amongst just some magnificent trees. And working in these forests actually, especially in the sort of the more sort of temperate regions, certainly compared to the UK, there's almost a familiarity with these forests, but also recognising they're also quite different. And so you will see ash and oak and beech, and in this case horse chestnut. This is the Japanese horse chestnut, Aesculus turbinata. And you'll also find, you know, maybe plants that you're familiar with. You know, in gardens generally we have magnolias, deutzias, hostas, and so forth. The Diphyllea in the bottom left there is a very interesting plant actually, because when it flowers the petals are translucent. It's quite a remarkable plant. But as I mentioned, you know, sometimes, you know, you do find things that are sort of quite widespread in horticulture, but you also get to experience perhaps the more unique or the rare plants. And in this case here we have Helwingia japonica, and this is a fascinating plant because it flowers and fruits on the midrib of the leaf, and it's pollinated by insects, by flies typically, and it's a very sort of, from an evolution perspective, is sort of a very early plant, and part of the reason for this strategy is that in those sort of kind of dark, sort of shadowy, sort of, you know, layers of vegetation, by having the flower in the middle of the leaf on that midrib, just helps the insects sort of locate that flower. And then we also have parasitic plants. So this is Lithrea japonica, and typically this will parasitize on hazel, birch, oak, alder and elm, and because it doesn't have any chlorophyll, it takes everything that it needs from those plants that it's parasitizing. And so with these botanical surveys, you know, the sort of sample site, if you like, is, rather than it being like a measured quadrat or, you know, 100 metres by 100 metres and so forth, what we're looking for is a homogeneous landscape unit. And the boundary of that sample point could be defined by a track or a stream or a distinct change in topography. And the idea is to record and capture every vascular plant species that occur within that survey site. And so often when we get back to where we're working from, this is a fairly typical scene where we're processing these vouchers, and in many cases, and again this comes down to the importance of collaborating and working with partners, you know, being able to get a name to each of these specimens, but that isn't always possible, and that's why kind of having these dried specimens and then using herbaria to enable us to put a name to them, you know, is so important. And often we're working, you know, away from the city in different locations, and you know, from my perspective, it's wonderful to have the opportunity to sort of stay in local Ryokan and sort of, you know, experience and enjoy, you know, these aspects of the work in Japan, which really is a privilege. And it is great to be able to stay in locations like this, but I do feel a little bit bad when the rooms sometimes look like this. And from my perspective, it's wonderful to be able to spend, you know, often actually long nights sort of trying to work out, you know, which plant is which, and kind of, you know, keying these things out. And it reminds me actually the first time that I visited Japan, and we had just finished a very long day surveying, and to my shame, I must admit, there were, you know, I was fairly ill prepared in terms of, you know, things generally, I think, and we were driving back, and we had a long journey back, and my colleagues just said to me and my colleague from Oxford, oh, we're just going to go for onsen. And in that moment, I didn't know what really that meant. I kind of vaguely, you know, I thought, okay, I think that is, you know, maybe, you know, a bath of some description. And then they explained, I said, oh, I said, you know, I don't have anything with me. And they're like, no, you're fine, it's fine. And then, yeah, very shortly, we sort of ended up in this onsen, and we all sat there enjoying the hot spring, and we've not looked back since. It was quite an experience, sort of sat there, sort of in this outdoor onsen actually, which is very enjoyable to say the least, and sort of sitting with colleagues and sort of, perhaps in a very British way, kind of just talking about the plants that we could see from the hot bath. But anyway. So we've got the botanical surveys, and a lot of that is informed by the database and research and so forth. But what we then try and do is to build on that, and this is in Toyama. This is part of the Mount Tateyama range, and one of many sort of sites, and building on those botanical surveys, which creates very accurate but very useful sort of baseline data. We then conduct our seed collecting. We will have target species for a number of reasons. These might be species that are important from a conservation perspective. They may be a priority for our Japanese partners. There's lots of different factors that influence what we're focusing on. But the method is what's important. And so there's a lot of data capture. And at the moment, or certainly historically, we've used just a paper format. And we're collecting a range of data from, you know, who's on the team that day, location data, you know, habitat information, population and sampling data, as well as the seed quality, and then herbarium vouchers and where they're going off. And recently, actually, trying to sort of streamline this, I've actually built an app that I'm going to be trialing this autumn, where we can capture this data sort of in real time, that colleagues in Oxford can see in real time, and it will hopefully label images and all sorts, but I will have paper backup, as I'm sure that this technology isn't always as reliable as it ought to be. But in addition to that sort of data capture, and yes, we've got herbarium vouchers, but you know, building those digital assets and photographing all of the plants that we collect, you know, not only enables us to maybe correct a name if we've made a mistake, but it also means that when we're, you know, doing our work at our respective gardens, that, you know, the sort of the teaching, the engagement, the public engagement and so forth, all of these digital assets can be used hopefully to inspire people and sort of future generations. And so having collected all of this seed, it's really important for a number of reasons that we clean the seed. And the best sort of example I could give, if you imagine going to Sainsbury's and buying a kilo of raspberries, you've got to get all the pips out and all the flesh gone. You know, what we don't want to be doing is sort of introducing any sort of pests and diseases, you know, either spreading them within Japan or bringing them back to the UK. So it's really important part of that process that all of this seed is cleaned. But again, it's a really great way to learn plants at almost an intimate level, but also sort of build this sort of digital asset. And because we take this very seriously, when our consignments come back to the UK, we will then send it down to forest researcher Alice Holt, who will X-ray the seed. And this informs many things really. In certain cases, it's actually sort of identified seed that has sort of got eggs or larvae in, which they can then safely dispatch of, but it can also start to inform us about viability rates. And if we're trying to develop germination protocols, especially for those range restricted or globally rare species, this is something that is really important. And then in addition to the seed collecting and the vouchers, well, and the photographs, sorry, is the herbarium vouchers. And years ago when I started this work, actually this was quite a laborious process of probably every day or every other day changing wet newspaper with the cuttings inside, and it would take a long time in certain cases to dry these herbarium vouchers. But I will be eternally grateful again to my colleagues in Japan who taught me the art of using a futon dryer to dry these specimens. And you can see here at the bottom that rather than, as you would traditionally do, sort of really cinch that press down and try and take the moisture out of the plants, actually what you do is you sort of layer it up with the newspaper and the foam inserts, and you kind of create this sort of wind tunnel essentially through the herbarium press. So there's been many a hotel in Japan where in the bathroom or in the hotel room it's been turned into a small herbarium with futon dryers drying plant material, but it's incredibly satisfying because actually by the time I wake up in the morning, 90%, if not more sometimes, are dry, which is great. Conifers, so we've got two species of fir here. We have Aedes laurisii and Aedes homolepsis, and these pose quite a challenge when it comes to creating good vouchers because of the cones, and also typically, even if you do manage to get them dry, all the needles fall off, and then it's not really much use. And again, our colleagues in Toyama sort of enlightened us to a method whereby these voucher specimens are kind of soaked for 48, 72 hours in an alcohol solution, and then when you take them out, actually, and then dry, the needles are retained, and it's very satisfying to be able to look at these voucher specimens years later and still see that detail. And in Oxford, we now have a large collection of herbarium vouchers of these wonderful plants that are all underpinned by botanical survey data, images, and so forth. And this is a really valuable resource because it will tell you where a species was, both in terms of sort of spatial and temporal, and contributes, to a lot of the conservation assessments and the other research that we carry out. We also, just to introduce you to a number of plants that have now grown from those collections, and these photos are either of plants in the Arboretum or where they were collected in situ. And so top left, we have Clethra barbernervis that looks very similar actually to a deciduous rhododendron or deciduous azalea. Wonderful autumn colour, the bark on it, sort of exfoliates and sort of lovely sort of patterns. So, a real favourite of mine because not only do you get, this lovely spring, fresh green growth, you get the autumn colour, but then because it's deciduous, you get this wonderful kind of winter structure with the wonderful stems. We then have, on the top here, we're going to go from the top left to bottom right, we've got the next two, the Japanese hazel, Corylus boliana, with this sort of wonderful arrangement of the nuts there, and then we get this lovely sort of purple sort of colouring on the leaf, and it really is a very attractive plant. We then have the monarch birch, Betula maximoitsiana. There are 11 species of birch that occur across Japan. There are 59 globally around the northern hemisphere, and this birch is the largest leafed of all the birches, and certainly in the UK this is a very important plant in terms of creating resilient landscapes in the face of climate change. We then have Hervinia dulcis, top right there, with this very sort of curious looking sort of fruit. And then in the middle row, left to right, we've got Codonopsis, Ampelopsis, and then in the middle we have a species of alder, and then we have a viburnum here. And then this plant here on the right, this is used to be sapiens, now Neochiracea japonica. And the reason I'm not using common names actually is often there aren't any. But this is going to be a really important plant. It's in the Euphorbia family, Euphorbiaceae, and something that we planted a fair amount of the Arboretum, and the autumn colour on this is absolutely spectacular. It's been planted on Acer Glade, and I think it's probably beginning to make some of the maples feel a bit uncomfortable with the show that they're putting on. And then bottom left we have actually two species of styrax, so Styrax herbacea and then Styrax japonica. The Styrax japonica is quite late flowering and is often planted as a street tree, and in fact that the next time you roll into Oyama and you come out of the train station and you go across the road, on your right hand side that whole street is lined with these Styrax, beautiful tree. We then have Eustaphis, bottom here with the red flower, and then we have Stuartia monodelpha, or the tall Stuartia in the tea family, and then we have another viburnum. And so this sort of combination of sort of science and conservation and horticulture, you know, is really key, and bringing it back to, you know, threatened plant species. You know, we can find the world's rarest plants, we can do the science and the research, but actually growing them, arguably, is almost more important, because you can find the rarest things, but if you can't grow them, you know, then we're going to really struggle. And so, several years ago now, working with the University of Tokyo, we had an opportunity to go and work on a species of birch. And at the time, this was in 2014, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature published the Red List assessment, which is a conservation assessment of the birch family. And this particular species of birch was not only listed as critically endangered, but in fact that there were only 21 individuals left in the world. That was it. And so, working with our partners, we were able to locate this population and conduct botanical surveys, photograph, but also collect seed of this critically endangered plant species. And I'm pleased to say subsequent work has actually identified further two populations, but part of the reason this is so fragile is it occurs, it's very closely related to sort of limestone outcrops, and it has a very limited range anyway, and then in combination either with limestone being quarried or with sort of typhoons and sort of severe weather events, you know, that has put it under great pressure. But I'm pleased to say that in 2014 and 2016 we were able to work on this species and to collect seed material and develop germination protocols for it. We were then able to share with our colleagues in Japan. At one point, there were more individuals growing in the Arboretum in Oxford than were known to be in the wild. But it was great to have the opportunity to collaborate with our partners in Japan on this and to bring this species back from the point of or the brink of extinction, and you know, and sort of share that with people. And it's great that you know, the plants actually kind of can create such headlines. And I have to be honest, I wasn't expecting one evening, genuinely, as I was cooking my tea, to get a phone call from the New York Times about a birch tree. But it was wonderful that, you know, that it was getting that level of coverage, and on the BBC and various other sort of news outlets. And this sort of got me thinking that, you know, globally 2 in 5 plant species are threatened with extinction. And if we go into London, if we go into any city, school and so forth, and ask people, can you name me an animal threatened with extinction? Typically, you get a good response. But if we flip that question and say, well, just name me one plant, just one plant, you know, often the response is nowhere near as good. And so, thinking about the Arboretum and how to sort of approach this challenge, I listed 20 trees, I could have done more, And then I looked up their conservation assessment based on the IUCN rating, and then I aligned them with their animal counterpart. So for example, the giant redwood is as endangered as the blue whale, and somehow by pairing a plant and an animal just sort of lifts it a bit in such a way, hopefully, that people will understand the significance. And so this is how this trail got developed, and so this Chichibu birch sits very much within that. So coming to an end now, I want to focus on going back to Toyama, the sort of horticulture sort of side of things. And as we know, Japan has an incredibly rich horticultural history and heritage. And as I mentioned, we can find these rare plants, but growing them is another thing. And across Japan, and coming back to Toyama and working with them, we have the sort of the significance of plants, but more specifically, with cherry trees. And I'd read about cherry trees that blossom in the spring, but until recent years I'd never experienced it myself. And being in Japan for the first time in the spring a couple of years back, really was the most incredible experience. As well as, and I hope NHK don't mind me using this graphic, but their wonderful cherry blossom forecast. And these wonderful trees, really capture, the hearts and minds of so many across Japan and further afield. And at Toyama, this is their sort of avenue of Yoshino cherry, which is a very widely, commonly sort of planted cherry tree. But these really are kind of sort of like living metaphors for beauty, and sort of remind us of that sort of cyclical rhythm of nature, and sort of they speak to us on so many levels. And I had the privilege of being in Toyama for their nighttime hanamai, and if you ever get the opportunity, it really is the most remarkable experience, and seeing these cherry trees in the daytime is one thing, but somehow that nighttime experience really was very special. And so finally it kind of brings me to the last part of my talk, which is with Toyama Botanic Garden, and coming back to Ohara-san here, and the team, and as part of our memorandum of understanding with them, they requested our assistance with 17 cultivars of cherry. And the request actually was for these to be sent back to Japan. And there were 5 cultivars, in fact, that were historically significant. These are the heritage cultivars that over the years, over time, had become extinct in Japan. And Collingwood Ingram or Cherry Ingram had been working on these and had very much hoped to have returned them to Japan in his lifetime, but was unable to. And in addition to those were these new introductions, cultivars that the team in Toyama thought would be really wonderful to have in Japan. And it was a tremendous privilege to have the opportunity to be part of that team, the team in Japan as well as the UK, to locate this material. And then in February 2019, I'm very pleased to say that all of this signwood material was sent back to Toyama, and in fact, is thriving and surviving very well indeed. And it's wonderful to see either those cultivars that were extinct back in Japan and thriving and forming part of that treescape, or the excitement of having new cultivars as well. It was great, obviously, that it also kind of garnered quite a bit of interest with NHK and the local media, but it also introduced me, I'm very pleased to say, to a number of different people, including on the left here, Asari Sensei, who developed, he was a teacher in Hokkaido, but developed all of the Matsumai cherries, and is featured actually in Naoko Abe's new book. And then also being introduced to Naoko as well. And whilst it is important to obviously find the rare and endangered plants, I think the horticulture and the culturally significant cherry trees have given rise to this new exciting project that we're working on with the team from Toyama and Naoko and various other people. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you this evening about, very briefly, our new Blossoms Across Borders project, which has been made a reality actually thanks to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. And from Toyama's perspective, there is a second phase of cultivars that we would like to verify in the UK and repatriate to Japan. And from our perspective, we would like to document and collect the 11 wild species of cherry that occur across the country and bring those into the UK for people to enjoy across the UK, hopefully. So finally, I think, you know, the vision for this work is very much about strengthening the relationship through plants, through science, horticulture, heritage and culture. And I would like to thank the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation for their support, as well as the support from many others, the Sasakawa Foundation, as well as the team in Japan and Oxford and so forth. And thank you for your time and allowing me to speak this evening.
And if you want to sit down, you don't have to. Well, thank you so much, Ben. That was a really interesting talk, and it's so important, this work that you're doing, evidently, and which I was very lucky to be able to see in the Oxford Arboretum. I'm going to start off the Q&A with probably not very scientific question, but I noticed that a lot of these photographs, you're on the top of a mountain. I'm wondering about the actual access. I noticed in one of the photographs a couple of people wearing helmets. How do you get up to these places? And I've come across a few people who've got lost in Japanese mountains as darkness has fallen and have had to spend the night there. And have you got any similar stories?
Yeah, I mean, remarkably, actually, access often is really good. And, you know, a lot of the trailheads you can reach, you know, on public transport even. And they're often, you know, some really wonderful, well sort of signposted trails and so forth. But also there are times where, you know, we do venture fairly far from, you know, sort of footpaths and so forth, as you would expect, to try and sort of find these rare plants. I can remember one time actually in Saitama Prefecture, as my Japanese colleagues sort of disappeared in front of me at a great pace up an incredibly steep sort of path. I'm thinking, I kind of knew I was a bit unfit, but I hadn't realised quite how unfit I was. But to my relief, and I actually tried to get this into the presentation this evening, they actually had a forest little like monorail. And so mercifully we were able to sort of climb sort of hundreds of metres up through this forest, sort of on this little kind of two-stroke powered monorail, which I was very pleased about.
Okay, well, I'm sure there are going to be plenty of questions from the audience, so if you'd like to ask one, please put your hand up. Okay, you got there first.
So I've read, sorry, talk loudly. I've read a lot recently about the establishment of the meta collection of Wallemia nobilis.
Yeah.
And I've like kind of been enjoying seeing them in various arboretums as I've been travelling around. Is there a parallel concept for some of the endangered species of Japan?
I'm pleased you asked that question actually. So the question was around sort of meta collections, these sort of conservation collections, and the one that Jen was referring to was instigated and developed by the Botanic Gardens of Sydney and focuses on the Wallemia pine, where they put a huge amount of work in conserving this species, but also distributing plant material into collections such as Kew and Oxford and various other places. And I happen to think it's one of the best examples of how, you know, or in more recent times of sort of commercialising a threatened plant, that money going into its in situ conservation, but then sharing that material. And this is something that we're very much looking to try and, not necessarily on that scale, but we're trying to sort of work on with colleagues in Japan. So the Paisir koyami and sort of several other species, and our hope is that, you know, even if it's on a much smaller scale, taking that model and then sort of sharing plant material both across Japan as well as sort of partners globally. Yeah.
Okay, who's next? Stephen.
Thank you very much, Ben. It was fascinating. I've done quite a lot of walking in through the mountains in Japan and tracking down ancient trees and so on. And I hadn't realised until I did that. I mean, the first time 4 or 5 years ago, is how much of a monoculture these forests are. In the mountain, 70% of Japan is mountainous and 70% forested, round numbers. But a huge amount. I mean, maybe just hinoki and sugi, cryptomeria. I mean, this completely sterile monoculture that you walk through until you get to the tops of these ridges, and then you find the native oaks and beeches and so on, which was a bit disappointing, and it was very striking. Because, I mean, this timber forestry has been going on for hundreds of years in Japan, and you know, it's. What's your response? I mean, what's your response to that?
So, as Stephen was saying, it's really striking when you travel through Japan, and on the one hand, I wish I didn't know how to identify plants, because as you were saying, you sort of see vast mountains and areas and regions just covered in a sort of monoculture, and these plantations of the Japanese cedar and so forth, you know, actually, you know, fully ready for harvesting, and this actually is a huge challenge in Japan because, you know, in a changing climate, there's a risk potentially in terms of forest fire, but you could also imagine if a particular pathogen took hold. You know, we've had sudden oak death or Phytophthora ramorum in the UK. You could imagine just how devastating on the landscape that would be. And so, albeit on a small scale, one of the things that we're trying to work on with our partners in Japan is actually where plantations are coming down, is sort of trialing sort of restoration. And there's a lot of research. Remarkably, there's the most incredible seed banks underneath these plantations, which in itself is encouraging. So, you know, if areas were harvested or were lost, perhaps, that it's encouraging that there is that viable seed bank. But this is also where the database comes in, because the records in that database go back to the early 19th century, and we can configure that database to only model data going up, for example, say to the 1930s, and that will tell us where a species either is or was. And so what we can do is add that over maps of plantations and sort of predict the potential vegetation, you know, for those areas. And this is something that we've been working on with the Shikoku sort of regional forest directorate. But yeah, it is a big challenge.
Okay, Yoko-san, did you have a question?
Yes. Thank you very much for the fascinating lecture. I'm from Japan, but I'm also from Toyama originally. So I had a pleasure of visiting the botanical garden in Toyama last year to see those talking trees thriving, as well as those otherwise extinct cherry trees are also doing very well. So I'm very glad to hear that this project is continuing. My question, because I have two questions, but one question is, what you have been successfully doing so far with Toyama Prefecture, could this be replicated with other prefectures and partners in Japan? And is that also your plan?
Yes is the quick answer, and that is very much the hope. I mean, I've focused on Toyama this evening because I feel that collaboration, you know, has been very sort of equitable and has given rise, in particular, to the cherry tree project. But we've also been working with Makino Botanic Garden in Kochi Prefecture, and it is very much the hope that as this work in Japan continues, that we can sort of replicate this. We've worked with botanic gardens in Hokkaido, through to I think sort of Kochi, probably as far south as we've been. But yeah, that is the aspiration. Yeah.
Is it easy to find partners in Japan?
Is it easy to find partners? It has been a challenge at times, but actually on the whole, you know, our experience has been very positive, and I think taking the time to build those relationships, understand what these other gardens are working on, it's not just about what we would want to achieve, it's about understanding, you know, the balance of things. But yeah.
Could I just say something and apologise for being so late?
Right, carry on.
Just apologies. Just apologies for being so late. The Baroness and I got caught up, unfortunately. Just one very quick thing. Three of my sons have climbed. And it was absolutely fascinating. They came back completely exhausted, but regenerated in their appreciation for the fauna and flora of Japan.
So they were climbing Japanese mountains.
They were indeed, yes.
Okay.
And they're still climbing.
I think Alison at the back has climbed a few as well. Andrew, you had a question.
Yes, so taking on from Stephen's vested interest in trees in Scotland, an entirely benign one. Japan's jolly lucky that no idiot in Japan has decided that Sitka should be the plantation tree of choice. And if you can find a suitable Sitka pathogen in Japan that you could export to Scotland, we'd all be very grateful. But taking aside, the forests of the hills and mountains of Japan, some of which I've staggered through, were those, the commercial forests, the forests that have been planted, were they bare hill before? And were they planted, you say, after the war, and do you say 40, 50, 60 year time frames on commercial harvesting for these trees? Were they planted on bare land, or were they were forested previously?
Yeah.
So they were cleared and then replanted. So the species that have been planted are different from the ones that were there before and focused on.
Yeah, so historically, there would have been sort of natural forest and natural vegetation type, depending on where,
It's like the jungle rainforest, whatever natural.
for example, and I would say in most cases, typically if we take Japanese cedar from a forestry perspective, you're looking at harvesting that on a sort of a 40-year rotation, and they are now, a lot of these plantations are at the end of their second, and in fact are probably somewhere between 5 and 10 years beyond the typical sort of cut-off point for harvesting them.
And are there adverse effects in terms of acidification and soil depletion from the forestry cycle, or not so much? And how did they deal with brash and things, for instance?
My honest answer is I don't know.
Okay.
But yes, I imagine that it would have some impact, but yeah, it's certainly a challenge.
But you are dealing with the forestry companies and the authority like Sumitomo Rinkyo on trying to get diverse.
I'm not dealing. I have no kind of relationship with any sort of commercial forestry enterprises and so forth. I have been involved with sort of regional sort of forest agencies like the one in Shikoku, for example, and actually we've got to a point now where they have agreed that when certain plantations are clear felled, that we can use those as sort of trial sites from a forest restoration perspective. Yeah.
Okay, must be some more questions further back. Yes, lady, nearly at the back.
Can I ask a very late question? The cherries you mentioned, the 12 that were kind of repatriated to Japan, is there somewhere in the UK you can see them all together?
I don't believe they are all together. The main places I would recommend visiting to see a lot of them would be Great Windsor Park, Savile Gardens. Up at Keele University, they have a very good collection. If you are interested, and this is not a plug, but if you're interested in buying, then actually there's a nursery in Kent run by somebody called Chris Lane, who is arguably one of the foremost sort of cherry tree experts in the UK and has the most incredible witch hazel and cherry collection, which you can go and buy. My hope is in years to come you can come to the Arboretum in Oxford and see them there.
And what happened to Cherry Ingram's garden with all the cherries in?
So the Grange, I believe, still exists, and I think that's sort of appointment only. I'm not sure. There might be sort of open days at certain points in the year. I hope.
But the trees are basically
still there. Yeah.
Okay. Well, oh yes. Go ahead. Sorry, we're getting you the microphone.
How did they store the databases in the early 19th century?
So question was around how they sort of stored data in the early 19th century. This was really from herbarium vouchers, so sort of dried plant specimens, and then in later years transcribing the sort of the handwritten field notes and digitising those at a later point. So there were sort of physical specimens where somebody had, you know, sort of the likes of Makino, for example, would have sort of written his observations and his notes about, you know, and often in fact sort of describing species for the first time, and sort of fast forwarding is sort of is taking those historic data and digitising them and then sort of getting them into the format that we use today. Yeah.
Another one here.
I'm really interested by the dried specimens and what the benefits of them are today in comparison to photographs.
Good question. I mean, I suppose having a physical specimen, I don't know whether that sort of acts as sort of greater security compared to a digital photograph. I think from a teaching and learning perspective, being able to sort of hold something, you know, has value. I mean, what I would also say actually is that there are these huge digitisation programs and projects going on where, you know, herbaria are digitising millions of vouchers, making that available online, which is brilliant from, you know, research perspective. But I'd like to think that, I suppose it's a bit like, you know, do we need books? We can have a Kindle, you know. I guess it's probably that side of things, but yeah.
And where do you store all those vouchers? Is there something in the Arboretum itself where you keep all these things?
Well, I do have boxes of vouchers in my office, but at the moment in Oxford, the herbarium actually is moving from what was the plant sciences department into the new life and mind science building. And if you go into Oxford in that area at the moment, you'll see very fraught looking Stephen Harris, who's curator of the herbarium, moving millions of records across into his new facility. But yeah, they're all there.
Right, another question towards the back.
Thank you very much for the fascinating presentation, and I'm also from Japan. I'm very grateful for your wonderful present of repatriating the plants that went extinct in Japan. And in the interest of making sure that these cherries or birches are not going to extinct again, I'm wondering if you are taking some extra measures to make sure that these plants do not go extinct again, because I believe the original species that had gone extinct did so for reasons like climate or environment or, you know, some typhoons, etc. So I was wondering if you take some extra measures to make sure that these things would not happen again, or yeah, what kind of measures do you take?
So the quick answer is yes, and very briefly, you can put plants into two categories in terms of their seed type. You have what is called orthodox seed, which can be dehydrated and stored in a seed bank, and so we're doing that with the seed bank in Shinjuku Boyen, as well as the Millennium Seed Bank in the UK. And those collections that are stored in seed banks in some cases actually can last, you know, 4 centuries even, which is why that data is so important, so that if somebody uses that seed in 100 years' time, you know, they've got this valuable data set to support that. But then the other sort of seed storage behaviour relates to a seed type that's called recalcitrant. And an example of a recalcitrant species would be maybe a horse chestnut or an oak, where although you can dehydrate that seed, you can't rehydrate it. And therefore we have to, you know, this is where the living collections come in, where, you know, because we can't secure recalcitrant species in a seed bank, we need to have living collections like the Arboretum in Oxford, Toyama Botanic Garden and so forth, where these well-documented, you know, and in some cases threatened species can be safeguarded, a bit like the Wallamai pine.
Okay, any more? Oh, yes, another one there.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was really enjoyable. I
when you mentioned you observed lots of wildlife and animals when you were doing a botanical survey. I was just wondering if you observe some really rare insect species, which may be like unique pollinators or something to like a super rare plant species. Do you ever share your data or your observations with like insect specialists as well?
Yeah, I mean, the main observations, I suppose, that we make perhaps the sort of maybe on plant species such as I don't know the common name, but there's a sort of fairly widespread plant in Japan called asarum, and the pollination strategy for that plant is perhaps what we call by deception, where the flower looks like a fungus. And so these flies that typically would use a fungus to sort of lay their brood of eggs in are deceived by this plant, and there's no typical reward. There's no kind of nectar exchange. There's no reward for the fly. It's just being deceived, where it goes into the flower chamber. And it will lay its eggs, but it's not getting anything in return, and in the process will often either pick up or drop off pollen. I think as far as from the other way around, I suppose, there is a lot of research going on at the garden with Dr. Chris Thorogood, who looks a lot at these sort of relationships. But I think the important thing is as I said, is that collaboration and sort of making our research and our data available, so that if you were that expert, for example, we could support your work as well, hopefully.
Okay, well, it's not the end, because we're going to go downstairs and have a drink and carry on this discussion down there. It's probably going to be quite crowded, but please have a look at the exhibition in our gallery while you're about it. It'll be less crowded in there, and the exhibition is about Hiroshima, which is obviously not really connected to today's theme. But thank you so much, Ben. It's great to hear of this wonderful collaboration that's going on with Japan in such an important area. So very